I was halfway through a roast beef sandwich at the kitchen counter when Fritz slid a plate of radishes across to me with the solemnity of a man presenting jewels. They were from the rooftop garden, so naturally he thought they deserved a trumpet fanfare. Before I could decide if a radish went with horseradish, the doorbell rang. Now, Wolfe has rules about interruptions during mealships, not mine, but since I wasn't the one reclining in the dining room with duck à l'orange, I answered. A woman stood on the stoop, wrapped in a coat that said Fifth Avenue, but with an expression that said she'd forgotten how much Fifth Avenue had charged her. Mid-30s, hair dark enough to be called serious, and eyes that didn't waste time scanning the street. They fixed on me as if I was the butler who'd failed to fetch the carriage. "My name is Lorna Caldwell," she said. "I need to see Nero Wolfe at once." I gave her the kind of smile that covers both charm and sarcasm. At once is a tall order. Mr. Wolfe is otherwise engaged in digestion. He's very dedicated to digestion. She didn't blink. Then tell him it's a matter involving Wall Street, a cipher, and the threat of ruin. That should appeal to his appetites. That one earned her a raised eyebrow from me. Not many people, especially women with expensive perfume, knew how to bait Wolfe properly. I let her into the office. When Wolfe lumbered in 15 minutes later, freshly fortified by Fritz's duck and still adjusting the folds of his yellow silk robe, his first glance at her was a scowl. His second glance was at me, as if to say I'd committed treason by admitting her before the sacred digestion interval had cooled. "Madam," he rumbled, easing into his chair, "you will excuse my brevity." "Speak." She did, in crisp tones, as though reporting market losses. "My husband is a financial strategist at Peabody & Maris. Yesterday he received an envelope containing a single sheet of numbers. They were meaningless at first glance, but he is convinced it is a cipher, a warning tied to his work. Last night his private files were disturbed, nothing taken, only moved. Today he is missing. I found the same kind of paper in my purse this morning." She opened a leather bag and slid across a folded sheet. I unfolded it. Columns of numbers, neat but uneven, like the typewriter had hiccuped. "Police?" I asked. Her lips thinned. "No, my husband deals with sensitive clients. If word gets out that he has misplaced himself, it would be ruinous. And if this cipher is what he fears, it could be worse." Wolfe's fingers drummed on the arm of his chair. He did not lean forward, he never does, but I could see the gears turning behind the layers of disdain and girth. "You said cipher." "Why presume a cipher and not a prank or an error?" Her chin lifted. "Because my husband once told me, if anyone wants to hurt me, they won't use bullets, they'll use numbers." I admit that line had a nice sting. Wolfe's eyes narrowed, which in his world is the equivalent of a gasp. "Archie," he said without looking at me, "take the woman's particulars, then telephone Saul Panzer. I anticipate a need for his discrimination." And that was it. The case was in motion. Lorna Caldwell sat poised like she'd just shifted her assets into Wolfe's keeping. Wolfe closed his eyes, muttering something about idiots with codes, while I was left with the number sheet in my hand, and a growing suspicion that the brownstone's tranquility was about to be as disturbed as those files on Wall Street. The number sheet sat on Wolfe's desk like it had marched in and demanded a chair. Wolfe didn't touch it again once I had set it down. It became part of the room's atmosphere, a guest with bad manners. Lorna Caldwell perched on the red leather chair opposite him, her posture firm, as if the floor was made of thin ice and she was balancing on dignity alone. I started on the particulars because Wolfe had ordered it, and because she didn't strike me as the type who would tolerate a delay. She gave them in clipped bursts, age 36, residence on East 74th, married 8 years, one son away at boarding school, and a social circle that could fill the society pages if they cared to attend enough galas. Her husband, Franklin Caldwell, was a strategist at Peabody and Maris, which in financial lingo meant he advised corporations how to make more money without being accused of robbery. Wolfe grunted once when she said the firm's name. Whether it was recognition or indigestion, I couldn't tell. She leaned forward, her voice tightening. My husband told me that if anything happened, I was to come to you. He trusted no one else. He said you had a peculiar genius for seeing through fog. Wolfe's eyelids descended halfway. He didn't thank her for the compliment, though his lips did a little curl that might have passed as a private nod to vanity. What were the numbers on the first sheet? He asked. I didn't see them. He burned it after memorizing it. That got Wolfe's eyebrows into motion. Memorized? Foolish. He was meticulous, she countered, and frightened. Wolfe shifted his bulk in the chair, a subtle sign of growing attention. The sheet you brought this morning's intrusion into your purse, do you recognize its source? Typewriter, mimeograph, printer? She shook her head. It looks like a typewriter, but I can't be certain. I only know it was not mine, nor my husband's. Wolfe flicked his eyes at me. Archie, put it in the safe. That meant two things. The sheet mattered, and Wolfe didn't want it fluttering about like a loose playing card. I tucked it away, noting how Mrs. Caldwell's eyes followed it, as if it were a piece of her husband himself. Your files were disturbed, Wolfe said. Describe. It was Franklin's private cabinet in his study. Papers were not missing, but they had been handled, shuffled. He kept meticulous order. I know because he used to scold me if I touched his desk. Yesterday morning, he found pages turned, folders shifted. And this morning, Wolfe said, he's missing. Yes. Her hands gripped the edge of her bag. I left him at breakfast. He said he had an appointment. He did not return. His office told me he had called in sick. That is impossible. The silence that followed was broken by the faint clink of Wolfe's beer glass. Fritz had brought it in during her recital, and Wolfe accepted it without acknowledging the bearer. His eyes stayed on her, heavy and deliberate, as though weighing whether to indulge or eject her. "Why?" he asked finally. "Do you not summon the police?" Her answer came sharp, almost rehearsed, because Franklin believed this matter was not for them. He feared exposure. He said if I ever wanted to protect him, I should come here, and I am doing precisely that. I had been leaning against the corner of Wolfe's desk, jotting in my notebook. At that point I asked, what about enemies? Someone unhappy with the way your husband advised them to juggle their millions? Anyone left out of a deal? Her gaze slid to me, quick and cold. If you think Franklin made enemies, you would be right. If you ask me to list them, we would need more paper than that safe can hold. That earned her a slow inhale from Wolfe, who detested hyperbole almost as much as unexpected company. You imply a multitude, he said. Name 4. She hesitated, then Gregory Alton, one of his partners. They quarreled over a client portfolio. Jonathan Fenn, a shipping magnate. Franklin rejected his restructuring scheme. A woman named Clara Henshaw, who invested against Franklin's advice and lost. And her throat tightened. A cousin of mine, Paul Nesbitt. He wanted Franklin's introduction to a certain firm. Franklin refused. Paul has not spoken to me since. I wrote them down, mentally putting Alton, Fenn, Henshaw, and cousin Paul into a neat little suspect folder. Wolfe, meanwhile, was running his eyes shut, which is how he looks when he's letting thoughts settle into order. When he opened them again, he said, "Archie, you will arrange to see these 4. Begin tomorrow. First Alton, then Fenn. Saul will aid you." "Check," I said, though I wasn't thrilled about diving head first into the Wall Street shark tank. Mrs. Caldwell shifted in her chair. "You'll find him?" Wolfe let out a breath that ruffled his moustache. "Madam, I found nothing. I reason, if your husband has indeed been meddled with through a cipher, the intention is provocation or warning, not disappearance. Yet he has disappeared. That incongruity may be resolved. Whether he will be restored to you depends on the shape of the resolution. That wasn't the kind of assurance most women would accept with a grateful nod, but Mrs. Caldwell was not most women. She sat back, eyes glinting, and said, "Do what you must. Franklin trusted you. When she left, escorted by me to the door, she was carrying her bag like it contained something breakable. I returned to find Wolfe frowning at the ceiling, the beer half gone. "Well?" I asked. He turned his head, heavy as a pendulum. "Phui, a cipher. If there is indeed a design in those numbers, it is crude, but crudeness often conceals intention. I will study. Meanwhile, you and Saul will determine what Mr. Caldwell's absence has stirred in the waters." "Sure," I said. "And what if the fish bite?" He closed his eyes again. "Do not dangle your hand in the tank." That was Wolfe's version of fatherly advice. I went upstairs to type my notes, already planning tomorrow's schedule. But as I passed his safe, I couldn't help glancing at it. The sheet inside might have been only numbers, but it already had the brownstone in a state of mild upheaval. For Wolfe, that counted as a 4-alarm fire. What he didn't know yet, and what I couldn't shake, was the feeling that Franklin Caldwell's vanishing act wasn't the overture. It was the second act, and we come in late. If there's a part of this job I've grown used to, it's the way Wolfe can hand me a list of names and expect me to shake it like a cocktail until something suspicious rises to the top. That night, after typing up my notes and filing them where Wolfe wouldn't find a typo to grumble about, I called Saul Panzer. When Saul says I'll meet you at 9, it means he'll be there at 8:59 sharp, wearing the same expression he'd wear whether you were asking him to track a runaway heir or pick up a loaf of rye. That's why Wolfe uses him. Next morning, Fritz fortified me with scrambled eggs and apple coffee cake, and by 9 sharp I was in Saul's Buick, heading downtown to Peabody and Maris. The firm's offices were the kind of place where the walls are lined with abstract art you don't understand, and rugs so thick you worry you'll lose a shoe. They had their name etched in chrome behind the reception desk, as if anyone needed reminding they were in the business of moving millions. Our first target was Gregory Alton, one of Franklin Caldwell's partners. The receptionist gave us the professional once-over-my-time past inspection. Saul's plain suit raised an eyebrow, but we were ushered through to Alton's glass-walled office. Alton was in his 40s, trim, hair slicked so close it could have been painted on. He had the smooth manner of a man who never had to fight for a taxi in his life. "You're here on behalf of Lorna," he said after introductions, as if Wolfe's name was a technicality. How predictable. She was always inclined toward dramatics. She was inclined toward finding her husband, so I corrected him. "He's missing. You quarreled with him recently." His lips did something meant to pass for a smile. We disagreed. Strongly. Franklin believed a client's assets should be diversified. I believed the opposite. The client took my advice. Franklin was furious. I told him he was behaving like a schoolboy denied the best toy. Hardly grounds for vanishing, wouldn't you say? "Unless the toy in question bites," I said. Alton waved it off. Franklin had enemies enough outside this firm. Inside, we tolerated him because he produced results. If he's missing, it's not my doing. Do extend my regards to Lorna, though she's probably imagining villains in every shadow. Saul watched him without a word, eyes half-lidded, but I knew he was storing every syllable. We left with Alton's polished civility trailing us like cologne. From there, Saul dropped me at the St. Regis, where Jonathan Fenn held court. The shipping magnate had rented out an entire floor suite, and his secretary tried to stall me until I mentioned Wolfe. That name still opens doors, even ones guarded by men with diamond cufflinks. Fenn was bulk, where Alton was polish, thick-shouldered, booming voice, and a face flushed from either drink or indignation. He poured himself a whiskey before it was noon and gestured with it like a weapon. "Caldwell cost me $3 million, he thundered. 3. He talked me out of restructuring, said it would capsize the fleet. My fleet? I've been in shipping for 30 years. I don't need some banker telling me which way the wind blows. I let him rant until his glass was half empty, then asked, "Did you threaten him?" He barked a laugh. "Threatened?" I told him if he ever set foot on my ships, I'd toss him overboard. But that's bluster, son. I'd no more harm Franklin Caldwell than I'd sink my own flagship. A man in my position doesn't resort to theatrics. I hire lawyers, not thugs. Then you didn't send him a sheet of numbers? He squinted at me. Numbers? What devil is that? My business runs on numbers. Why would I waste them on puzzles? I believed his outrage, but outrage can be staged as easily as an opera. I left him red-faced and still talking about maritime honor. By late afternoon, I was sitting in a dim cafe across from Clara Henshaw. She was a widow with pearls at her throat and bitterness in her smile. She stirred her coffee as if it had personally wronged her. Franklin Caldwell, she said, voice clipped, assured me that investment in North Star Textiles was unwise. I ignored him, and I lost $80,000. My money, Mr. Goodwin, a lifetime's savings. I gather you didn't take that kindly, I said. Her eyes glittered. Kindly? I wanted to ruin him. I imagined it at night. But fantasies are not deeds. I wrote him a letter calling him a fraud, but I never touched a hair on his head. I couldn't. He was too clever, too insulated. If he's gone, it's not because of me. Though her lips curved, I can't say I mourn. There was honesty in her venom. If she had plotted, she wouldn't have confessed to wanting his ruin so readily. But honesty and guilt aren't mutually exclusive. I filed her under watch. The last call of the day was the hardest. Paul Nesbitt, cousin to Mrs. Caldwell. He worked out of a cramped office near Gramercy, a stark contrast to the glass and velvet of the others. Thin, nervous, with ink stains on his cuffs, he eyed me like a creditor. "So Lorna sent you?" he muttered. "She thinks Franklin was some paragon. He was a miser with his introductions. I asked him for one small favor to put me in touch with a firm that might have changed my life. He refused. Said it would tarnish his reputation. Reputation? What about mine? You were angry, I said. Angry? I swore I'd never speak to him again, and I haven't. If you think I'd bother sending riddles or sneaking around his files, you're mistaken. I can barely afford the subway, let alone hired snoops. His bitterness was as raw as Clara Henshaw's, but it carried the whine of a man more defeated than dangerous. Still, resentment can fester in ugly ways. By the time Saul dropped me back at the brownstone, the city lights were coming on, and I felt like I'd been auditioning suspects for a grim little pageant. Wolfe was in his chair with a book on orchids, though from the way his eyes didn't move, I knew he'd been waiting. "Well?" he demanded. I laid out Alton's arrogance, Fenn's thunder, Henshaw's bile, and Nesbitt's wounded pride. Wolfe listened with his eyes shut, fingers steepled. When I finished, he grunted. A predictable quartet. They despised him, each in a different key. Phooey! But none of them on your account has the ingenuity to contrive a cipher. Did you show them the sheet? No, I said. You told me to keep it sealed. Correct. He opened his eyes. They must be tested without foreknowledge. We will arrange that. He reached for his beer, took a slow sip, and added, Archie, observing enemies who shout are often harmless. It is those who whisper in figures that deserve attention. Caldwell's enemies may be many, but the author of that cipher is distinct. We will flush him out, I asked. And if Caldwell's already past flushing? Wolfe set down his glass with a deliberate thud. Then, Mr. Goodwin, someone has presumed upon numbers to attempt murder, and I do not permit presumption in my house. That was as close to a battle cry as Wolfe ever gets. And with that, the brownstone wasn't just disturbed, It was fully enlisted. The following morning, Wolfe greeted me with his usual mix of scorn and reliance. Scorn because he never tired of reminding me that legwork was menial, and reliance because without me there was no legwork. He had spent the previous night staring at the cipher sheet as if it were an orchid, with a disease too stupid to explain itself. By breakfast he was no closer to declaring victory, which meant I got to go out and see if people would slip up when numbers refused to. First on the docket was Alton again. I wasn't done with him, and I doubted Wolfe was either. His office secretary tried to give me the polite shuffle, claiming Mr. Alton was too busy for an informal visit, but I explained that the only thing informal about me was the way I tied my shoelaces. The alternative was me waiting in his office until he returned from whatever meeting he was hiding behind. That opened the door. Alton was already irritable, tapping a Mont Blanc pen against a glass desk. "Back again, Mr. Goodwin? Don't you people take no for an answer?" "Depending on who's saying it," I replied, settling in a easy chair without permission. "You said you and Caldwell quarrelled. Funny thing, though people around here say you've been nervous since he went missing." Not gloating, nervous. "What's keeping you up at night, Alton? Afraid someone thinks you have a motive?" His jaw tightened just enough to let me know I wasn't inventing the gossip. People talk. It means nothing. Caldwell was reckless. He attracted dangers, that's all. "Danger that sends typewritten puzzles?" I asked lightly. His pen stopped. For the first time he blinked, slow and deliberate. "What are you implying?" "Nothing yet. But let's say Caldwell had a habit of burning strange messages instead of filing them. And let's say someone knew about that habit. Wouldn't it be interesting to know who else had seen one of those sheets before yesterday?" That earned me a glare cold enough to frost the desk glass. He shoved back his chair. "If you think I'm indulging this performance, you're mistaken. Leave. Now." So I did, because when a man pushes you out that fast, it's either because you've touched a nerve or because he's late for a lunch reservation. Wolfe would want to hear about the nerve. I left Alton's slick palace of finance and headed south to check on Jonathan Fenn. The man had left his suite at the St. Regis and was touring one of his ships docked on the Hudson. I met him at the pier, surrounded by a small entourage of men in navy coats who looked like they'd been hired less for nautical expertise than for muscle. Fenn was barking orders about ballast as if anyone cared. He spotted me, and his scowl was instant. "You again? Did Caldwell's pampered wife send you to harass me until I confessed to sins I didn't commit?" "Not quite," I said. "But Wolfe thinks men with booming voices often hide whispers in the background. I'm here to see if you've got any." That landed about as well as seawater on silk. Fenn jabbed a finger at me. "Listen, Caldwell's disappearance is his own fault. He meddled, always meddled, and I told him if he sabotaged me again, I'd see him sink. You want a confession? There it is, but don't twist it into crime. I said words, not deeds." He turned back to his entourage, clearly finished with me. I walked away with more sound than sense, though sometimes sound is enough to show a man's breaking point. Fenn was volatile, maybe too volatile to have orchestrated something as calculated as a cipher, but his temper could easily have been borrowed by someone calmer. After Fenn, I decided it was time to circle back to Clara Henshaw. She lived in an Upper West Side apartment, the kind that traded charm for too many doilies. She received me with suspicion. Her bitterness from the day before hadn't softened overnight. "You think Franklin's vanished because of me?" she demanded, before I'd even sat down. "Well, I wish I had that kind of power, but women like me don't write ciphers, Mr. Goodwin. We cry into our coffee and go on." "Except you don't look like you've been crying," I said. "You look like you've been waiting." "For what?" Her eyes narrowed. "For Franklin to come crawling back and admit I was right, for him to say I was cleverer than he gave me credit for." That's what I wanted. But now I wonder if he's simply gone where clever men sometimes go too far. It was an odd answer, tinged with both scorn and grief. I left her with her coffee and carried the impression back with me of a woman who hated him, yes, but maybe not enough to script his disappearance. That left cousin Paul Nesbit. He had an accountant's office that looked poorer in daylight than it had the night before, with peeling wallpaper and an adding machine that probably predated the Depression. He greeted me like a man already exhausted. "You again? What now?" "Now," I said, "I want to know whether you've been in touch with anyone at Peabody and Maris since your falling out with Caldwell." "No," he snapped. "Why would I? They all look down on me, Franklin most of all." "'Cause sometimes the best way to ruin a man is through his own circle," I said, leaning on his desk. And if someone wanted Caldwell out of the way, who better than a resentful relative with nothing to lose? His hands trembled. He tried to cover it by shuffling papers. "I wouldn't dare." "Do you know what that firm would do to me if I tried? They'd crush me before I could even spell Cipher." "I may be bitter, Mr. Goodwin, but I'm not suicidal." There it was, that word again. Cipher. I hadn't brought it up this time. He had, which meant one of two things he had heard, gossip already, or he knew more than he wanted to admit. I pressed him, but he clammed up, insisting he had read something in the papers. When I asked which paper, he waved vaguely toward the stack on his chair, all of them blank of any mention of numbers. I left him sweating behind his ledger. By the time I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was knee-deep in orchids upstairs. I gave him the day's report after he waddled down for beer. His eyes sharpened at the detail about Nesbit blurting out the word Cipher. He made a sound that was half grunt, half growl. "Idiotic," he muttered. "If he is guilty, he is an imbecile. If innocent, he is an imbecile. Neither prospect pleases me. Then where does that leave us?" I asked. "Waiting," he said, "and preparing. The intruder will not confine himself to sheets of numbers. He will trespass again. Be alert, Archie. Our sanctuary is no longer in violation." It was Wolfe's way of saying the brownstone itself was about to be dragged into the mess. And sure enough, that night, while I was checking the office safe before locking up, I noticed something I didn't like. The cipher sheet we'd placed inside was not where I'd left it. It was still there, but shifted, as though someone had handled it with care, not theft. The brownstone had been trespassed, and Wolfe, for all his immobility, was suddenly very much awake. If there's one thing Wolfe considers sacred, it's the brownstone's immunity from the outside world, the orchids upstairs, the meals Fritz lays out with the delicacy of an old master, the beer rotation. These aren't luxuries to Wolfe, they're articles of faith. So when I found the cipher sheet nudged from its resting place in the safe, it was less a clue and more a thunderclap. Someone had breached the temple, and no matter how Wolfe pretended otherwise, it got under his skin. I stood there staring at the safe. The folded paper shifted just enough to tell me a hand that wasn't mine, or Wolfe's, had been at work. I'd checked it the night before, locked, and spun the dial myself. Fritzy wouldn't touch Wolfe's files with a broom handle, and Wolfe, for all his girth, wasn't limber enough to practice sleight of hand behind my back. That left one possibility our visitor hadn't left after all. He'd returned. When I told Wolfe, he went still. Stillness in him isn't relaxation, it's his version of pulling a sword. His eyes lowered to half-mast, his lips compressed, and when he spoke, his voice had the weight of iron. "Describe." I did, sparing no detail. Wolfe listened without moving, then said, "Phooey." Whoever it was knew what to seek. That is intolerable. "The question is," I said, "how did they get in? I locked up. The chain was set. If someone came by the window, we'd know, unless we've got a ghost with a locksmith's certificate." He didn't rise to the joke. There is no ghost. There is negligence. You will examine every latch, every key. Then you will sit in that office until your eyes are red, and you will watch. It was after midnight before I let myself sag into the red leather chair, gun in the drawer, notebook on my knee. The house was quiet except for the sigh of pipes. I told myself I was ready if our cipher spreader returned, but the truth was, if he'd gotten in once without me hearing, he could likely do it again. I had to hope he'd leave me a trace. By dawn, nothing. My eyes burned, my ears buzzed with silence. At 7, Fritz came padding in to begin his day, eyeing me with pity before heading to the kitchen. At 8, Wolfe appeared, scowling more at the intrusion on his schedule than at my bloodshot face. He didn't thank me for the vigil, naturally. Gratitude isn't in his toolkit. "Archie," he said, "we are being tested. Whoever did this wanted us to know an intrusion without theft is not intrusion, it is a message. And the message reads, what? I can touch you anytime I like? Precisely. Which means the author is reckless or supremely confident. Both are intolerable traits." He tapped his lips. "We will turn the message upon him." That morning brought no new caller at the brownstone, which was almost disappointing. I half expected Mrs. Caldwell to return, frantic with new developments. Instead, Wolfe ordered me to visit Alton and Fenn again, but more obliquely. Do not confront, lurk, attend, see who follows you. If someone is impudent enough to trespass here, he may be impudent enough to trail you. So I did. I planted myself near Alton's office lobby, pretending to read a paper. He came and went with his usual polish, and I caught nothing unusual except the glances of a young clerk who seemed too interested in me. Whether curiosity or something more, I filed it for later. At Fenn's hotel suite, the situation was louder, Fenn shouting down a telephone about demurrage fees while 2 aides hovered. He saw me and barked, still digging, "Goodwin, tell Wolfe I'll not be blamed for Caldwell's cowardice." I tipped my hat and left, but the words stuck. Cowardice. That wasn't a word Fenn would use lightly. Did he know more about why Caldwell vanished than he admitted? Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was not pleased with the thinness of my results. He glared at me, then at the cipher sheet, which he had retrieved from the safe as if daring it to speak. It still lay mute, its columns of numbers smug in their silence. "You will take Saul tonight," he said finally. "You will guard this house as if it were the gold reserves at Fort Knox. Whoever returns must be seen." So that night Saul joined me in the office. He sat, calm and unreadable, while I paced, restless as a cat. Hours passed. Midnight. 1, 2, nothing. At 3 I was ready to call it, but Saul lifted a finger. His ears had caught what mine missed, a faint scrape, the whisper of a latch. I drew my gun. Saul didn't move. He just watched as the office door creaked, not the front entrance, not a window, the office door, which meant the intruder had been inside already. My throat went dry. A shadow stirred, then a figure slipped in, a man, lean, face half covered, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged. He went straight to Wolfe's desk as if he'd memorized the layout. His hand reached for the safe. "Hold it!" I snapped, stepping forward with my gun leveled. "You've won a prize!" Me. The man froze. Saul was up in an instant, moving silent as smoke, blocking the exit. The intruder's eyes flicked between us, calculating. Then he laughed low, humorless. "You're quicker than Caldwell was," he said. That name hit like a slap. Before I could demand more, he pivoted hard, knocking over a chair, and bolted. Saul lunged, but the man twisted with a practiced slip and was out the hall before either of us could pin him. By the time we reached the stoop, the street was empty. He'd vanished into the city's veins. Back inside, Wolfe sat, waiting in his chair as if he'd known all along. When I told him what the man had said, Wolfe's eyes gleamed narrow and dangerous. So he spoke. "That was no burglar, Archie. That was a herald." "Herald of what?" I asked. "Of an escalation," Wolfe said. "Our adversary has declared himself." Caldwell was slower. "We must be quicker, much quicker." He closed his eyes, steepling his fingers. I watched him, uneasy. Wolfe might have been immovable in body, but his mind had already leapt ahead. The trespass hadn't just disturbed the brownstone, it had baited him, and Wolfe, though he'd never admit it, was beginning to relish the hunt. Wolfe didn't pace, not even when someone had just proven they could stroll into his office like they owned stock in it. He sat in that oversized chair, hands steepled, eyes shut, as if motion itself would cheapen the insult. I, on the other hand, had worn a track into the rug. Saul had gone home at dawn after our visitor's vanishing act, and I'd spent the next few hours waiting for Wolfe to explode. Instead, he merely brewed. When Fritz finally placed breakfast before him, Wolfe lifted his fork, sniffed at the eggs, and said, "Archie, call Inspector Kramer," just like that. No rant, no profanity, just a curt order. That's how I knew the pressure had cut through even his armor. Wolfe never invites the law unless his hand is forced. Kramer arrived an hour later, cigar planted like a permanent fixture in his jaw. He stomped into the office, gave me the usual glare, and dropped into a chair. "All right, Wolfe. Archie says you had a prowler. Let me guess, you expect me to post a squad car out front while you sit in your robe and do nothing?" "I expect you," Wolfe replied, "to recognize when your jurisdiction has been mocked." "A man entered my house with impunity," he taunted my assistant. "He was named Caldwell. That alone should stir you." Kramer blew smoke at the ceiling. "It stirs me that you sat on it until now. Why didn't you call me last night?" "Because," Wolfe said, voice cool, "I wished to determine whether the trespass was mere impudence or tactical." "It is the latter, yeah? And what am I supposed to do about it?" Kramer barked. "You've got no description except lean guy, half a face covered. Sounds like half the city at night. I can't post a man on every stoop." "Nor need you," Wolfe said. "I require only that you accept Caldwell's disappearance as more than a marital whim." He did not wander. He was taken, or driven. Kramer's eyes cut to me. "And you back him up?" I shrugged. "The man last night wasn't casing for silverware. He went for the safe. And he said Caldwell was slower. Sounds personal to me." Kramer grunted. "Fine. I'll have a man check Caldwell's apartment again. But if this is another one of your puzzles, Wolfe, and I waste my men's time, you will bark louder," Wolfe finished. "Yes, yes. Spare me." Kramer left, muttering, and the office air cleared of cigar fumes but not of tension. Wolfe sat silent until Fritz whisked in to refresh his beer. Only then did he speak. "Archie, summon Mr. Panzer again. Tonight we bait the hook." That was classic, Wolfe no fuss, no raised voice, but an undertone that meant I'd better polish my shoes and load my revolver. The day stretched, with me making calls, chasing down background on our quartet of suspects. Alton had been seen in heated discussion with another partner late the previous evening. Fenn had cancelled a luncheon. Clara Henshaw had been spotted at her bank, withdrawing a hefty sum, and Cousin Paul had shuttered his office with a flimsy sign reading, "Closed indefinitely." Each move could be a coincidence, or each could be a maneuver. By the time dusk fell, the brownstone felt less like a sanctuary and more like a bunker. Saul arrived promptly as always, and this time Wolfe was direct. "The intruder will return. He must. He has begun a dance, and men who begin dances must complete them. We shall wait." So we did. Saul sat by the window, eyes trained on the street. I was at the desk, revolver ready. Wolfe reclined, eyes closed but ears keen, as if every creak of wood carried meaning. Midnight came, 1 o'clock. Then, just as my eyelids were beginning to betray me, there it was, the faintest rustle from the kitchen corridor. Saul was up before I could blink, silent as a cat. I moved toward the office door. Wolfe didn't stir. A shadow slid across the hall, quicker than last time, more brazen. He came straight in, gloved hand reaching for the safe again. This time, Saul stepped out of the darkness and blocked him. I moved in behind, gun steady. The man froze, his eyes sharp, calculating flicked between us. Then with a sudden grin he spoke. "You're persistent." "Caldwell wasn't. That's why he's gone." "Where?" I snapped. "Where is he?" He tilted his head, mocking. "Ask your fat genius. Maybe he's already solved it." Saul lunged, but the man was slippery. He tossed something small, metallic, toward the floor. It clattered, sharp and unexpected, and in the split second our eyes darted to it, he spun through the doorway. By the time we hit the stoop, the street was empty again, only a dark sedan turning the corner 2 blocks down. The object he'd tossed lay glittering on the rug. I picked it up. A brass key, old-fashioned, with the number 217 stamped into it. Back inside, Wolfe finally opened his eyes. "Well?" I handed him the key. He examined it, nostrils flaring. A hotel key, cheap, not New York. Newark, perhaps. "Archie, trace it. Saul, remain until dawn. By morning I had my lead. Room 217, the Baylis Hotel, Newark." I drove out, leaving Saul to guard Wolfe's fortress. The Baylis was the kind of establishment where the wallpaper peeled in surrender, and the clerk asked no questions as long as cash appeared. With a $10 bill greasing the wheels, I learned that 217 had been rented 2 nights ago under the name Franklin C., but no one matching Caldwell's description had been seen. Instead, a man thin, sharp-eyed had paid in advance and came and gone irregularly. I had the clerk open the room. It smelled of stale smoke and cheap soap. The bed was untouched, but the desk held scraps of paper. On them, numbers, rows and columns scrawled by hand. Not the same as our cipher sheet, but cousins. Someone had been working or rehearsing. In the wastebasket, another sheet, Caldwell's name, half written, then crossed out. I pocketed the scraps, locked up, and headed back to Manhattan. Wolfe listened as I laid it out. His expression was unreadable until I showed him the papers. Then he let out a grunt, low and satisfied. "Good. The pattern tightens. Caldwell's fate is tethered to numbers, and numbers are my province. Tonight, Archie, we begin to answer the cipher." He leaned back, eyes closing, lips curling into the faintest of smiles. And I, standing there with the reek of the Baylis still on my coat, knew the pressure was no longer from outside. It was inside the brownstone now, coiled and ready. Wolfe never treated numbers like mere symbols to him. They were organisms with a pedigree. He sat with the cipher sheet, the scraps I'd fetched from the Baylis, and a stack of graph paper Fritz had produced, as though the kitchen supply could double for a cryptographer's lab. From my vantage point at the desk, he looked less like a man decoding a threat than a botanist identifying a rare hybrid. His lips pressed, his eyes half shut, and every so often his massive hand would jot a line of digits with that delicate fountain pen of his. Meanwhile, I fielded calls. Saul reported no return visits during my Newark run. Kramer called, predictably barking, demanding to know why the Baylis Hotel had cropped up in his men's reports. I told him Wolfe was working and that results would follow. He swore and hung up, which was as close to encouragement as Kramer gets. By late afternoon, Wolfe made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a grunt. "Archie," he said, "our adversary is neither original nor brilliant. He employs a visionaire cipher, crudely masked. This is schoolboy stratagem. I didn't cheer, then you cracked it." "Partially. Caldwell's name appears, alongside notations of time and place. One entry reads Baylis 2 Nights, another Transfer Henshaw 3. He tapped the paper. "And this Nesbit cover final." That was enough to make my pen stop mid-scribble. You're saying Clara Henshaw's involved? And Cousin Paul? I am saying the author intends us to believe so, Wolfe corrected, which is not the same thing. False trails are the cheapest commodity in crime. Nevertheless, the cipher confirms what intuition suggested. Caldwell's circle is the battlefield. We must maneuver. His version of maneuvering meant summoning in increments. Wolfe didn't storm suspects. He arranged them like chessmen and waited for the right configuration. He told me to call Mrs. Caldwell first. She arrived that day, evening, pale but composed, her dark coat buttoned high. "You found him?" she asked at once. "No," Wolfe said, "but we have found his shadow. He was at the Baylis Hotel, or represented there. He is entangled in figures, codes." "You know this already?" Her lips pressed together, but she didn't deny it. "Franklin said his enemies would use numbers, but I never thought she would break off," shaking her head. "You must think," Wolfe said, tone sharpening. "You will tell me everything your husband confided in you. Do not trifle. If you omit, you imperil him." She hesitated. Then, in a low rush, there was a fund, a private pool he managed separate from the firm, discretionary investments for certain clientsmen who valued secrecy above legality. He told me once if it ever came to light, he'd be ruined. And others with him. "Names?" Wolfe demanded. She shook her head. He never shared them. He only said one was powerful enough to ruin us both. That was all Wolfe needed. He dismissed her with a nod, and when she left, he murmured, "So." The cipher is not mere warning, it is leverage. Someone seeks to expose or to silence. Next he ordered me to bring in Alton, on pretext of clarifying Caldwell's schedule. Alton came, sleek as ever, but his irritation cracked when Wolfe mentioned the Baylis. "You've no right," Alton snapped. "That squalid place has nothing to do with this firm." "On the contrary," Wolfe said, his voice like chilled steel. "It has everything to do with Caldwell's vanishing. Do not prattle. If you continue to obstruct, you will find yourself explaining to the police why your partner's name appears in cipher beside places he never should have been." Alton's smoothness faltered, just for a second. His hands clenched the arms of the chair, but then he recovered, sneered, and stood. "You're bluffing. Good day, gentlemen." He left in a hurry that told me Wolfe had rattled him more than he'd admit. That night, Wolfe closed his eyes and spoke as if dictating to himself. "They are converging, Archie. Alton fears exposure. Fenn rages. Henshaw broods. Nesbit trembles. Each will move soon, pushed by the cipher. We shall be ready." The next morning proved him right. A letter arrived, slipped under our door some time before breakfast. Plain envelope, typed address. Inside, a single line in numbers. Wolfe translated it in 5 minutes. "Caldwell tonight." I stared. "That's not subtle. He's warning us he's going to kill Caldwell." "No," Wolfe said calmly. "He is daring us. He is declaring a finale, expecting an audience. Which means Caldwell lives for now. The question is where and which of his circle will attend the closing act. He called Saul and Fred Durkin, instructing them to fan out. Find Caldwell. Do not confront, merely report. Archie, you will bait Nesbit. He is the weakest. His tongue may wag if pressed. So I did. I found Cousin Paul in a dingy cafe, nursing coffee as if it were currency. He jumped when he saw me. "Enough games," I told him, sliding into the booth. "I know about the cipher. I know your name is in it. Tonight something's happening. You want to be caught in that crossfire?" He went pale. "I didn't, Archie. I swear I never touched Franklin. But they Alton, Fenn, maybe even Clara, they talked of shutting him up. I only listened. They laughed at me, said I was too small to matter. Where's Caldwell?" I pressed. "I don't know." He clutched his cup. But they said Baylis again, and something about moving him before dawn. That was enough for me. I left him sweating and headed back. Wolfe heard my report, and for once his lips curled into a thin smile. "Excellent. They are indeed conspiring, though their alliance is brittle. Tonight they will try to conclude matters. We shall intervene. Assemble them tomorrow, Archie. Here, the brownstone will host their undoing." His eyes glittered with that rarest of things, anticipation. He wasn't merely reacting anymore. He was positioning, pulling strings. The game had shifted to his board, and Wolfe, immovable in his chair, was finally on the attack. Wolfe never enjoyed summoning guests, least of all people who brought the smell of trouble into his office, but when the situation called for it, he treated the ritual like a general arranging troops on the field. That morning, he dictated the invitations in his measured growl, leaving me to make the calls and craft the bait. Each suspect would be told that Wolfe had information concerning Caldwell's fate and that their presence was not optional. Alton's secretary tried to dodge, Fenn roared down the line, Clara Henshaw went icy, and Cousin Paul stammered. But by evening they had all agreed. Wolfe knew the art of leverage, hint at knowledge, imply exposure, and people can't resist showing up to measure how much you know. By 7:30 the Brownstones' office was prepped for war. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle, the windows shut tight, Wolfe's beer lined up within reach. He looked serene, but his eyes were sharper than I'd seen them in days. "Archie," he said, "no firearms in evidence. We require tongues, not bullets." "Sure," I said, "but if one of these fine specimens lunges for my throat, I'd like to be more persuasive than a dirty look." "Your persuasion," Wolfe muttered, "resides in your presence. Let it suffice." At 8 sharp, the bell rang, and I began ushering them in one by one. Gregory Alton came first, sleek and irritable, his hair as precise as a blueprint. Then Jonathan Fenn, filling the doorway with his bulk and indignation. Clara Henshaw followed, pearl-strung and tight-lipped, her eyes darting like she was already rehearsing denials. Last was Paul Nesbit, pale and sweating, looking like he'd rather be anywhere but in Wolfe's lair. They sat, avoiding one another's eyes, though the air between them was thick with unspoken accusations. Wolfe cleared his throat, a sound like a slow engine. "Starting. Ladies and gentlemen, I have imposed upon your time for a purpose. Franklin Caldwell, your associate, adversary, or relative, is alive, for the moment. He is entangled in a scheme involving numbers, codes, and the misappropriation of trust. The cipher delivered to this house confirms as much. That word, cipher, made them shift." Alton stiffened, Fenn scowled, Clara's lips compressed, and Paul looked like he might faint. Wolfe let the silence stretch, savouring their discomfort. "The cipher," he continued, "was no masterstroke. It was childish, a visionaire, half-hidden. I solved it. It named each of you in turn, linking you to places, times, and intentions. Baylis Hotel, transfers, cover, final. If one wished to fabricate a net of suspicion, one could not choose better fodder." Fenn slammed a hand on the armrest. "I've never seen your damned cipher." "Nor need you," Wolfe replied coldly. "Your protestations are irrelevant. What matters is who authored it and why. Caldwell was the intended victim, yes, but the cipher's deeper purpose was to pit you against each other, to corrode alliances, to make you each fear exposure." Clara leaned forward, her voice sharp. "And you, Mr. Wolfe? What do you gain by dragging us here? To frighten us? To play with omniscience?" "I gain," Wolfe said evenly, "what I always seek: order and truth. The trespass upon my house obliges me. The author of the cipher entered this room, my safe, my very sanctuary. He sought to unsettle me. He failed." The words landed like stones. Paul's hands shook so badly he nearly dropped his handkerchief. Alton's jaw worked, but he said nothing. Fenn muttered into his moustache, and Clara sat rigid, her pearls trembling against her throat. Wolfe turned his gaze, heavy and deliberate, toward Alton. "You quarrelled with Caldwell. You feared his discretionary fund would imperil the firm. Did you pen the cipher? Alton's eyes flashed. No, Caldwell was reckless, but I would never reduce myself to cheap puzzles. I told him what I thought. That's more than some here can claim. Wolfe dismissed him with a flick of the eyes and swiveled, slowly, toward Clara. You lost money. You blame Caldwell. You confessed to hatred. Did you craft the cipher as vengeance? She inhaled sharply, eyes glittering. I hated him, yes, but I am not a schoolgirl scrawling riddles. I wanted him ruined in the open, not kidnapped in the shadows. If I had the power to destroy him, you would not be lecturing me now. Again, Wolfe let her words hang before turning, inexorably, to Fenn. You thunder, you threatened him. Did you place his name beside death in columns of figures? Fenn leaned forward, his bulk menacing, but Wolfe did not flinch. I don't need to scribble numbers, Wolfe. When I want a man destroyed, I do it in contracts and courts. Caldwell was a meddler, but I'd not dirty my hands with ciphers. Someone else is playing games. Finally, Wolfe's eyes landed on Paul. The cousin shrank into his chair. Wolfe's voice softened, but the weight remained. And you, the cipher bore your name. Cover, final, explain, Paul stammered, his voice barely audible. I didn't write it. I couldn't. I heard them talk, Alton and Fenn, about Caldwell, about shutting him up. I thought if I stayed quiet they'd forget me. But then my name appeared and I panicked. I swear I didn't enough, Wolfe interrupted, raising a hand. You each deny predictably. But denial is immaterial. Caldwell is alive. That fact damns the liar among you. And tonight you will reveal yourself. The room bristled. I watched their faces. Alton was too smooth, Fenn too loud, Clara too cold, Paul too frantic. Wolfe leaned back, steepling his fingers. The cipher was bait. Caldwell's fund is the prize. Someone among you sought control, or concealment, or both. By entangling the others, the author hoped to shield himself, but arrogance betrayed him. He trespassed here into my house to prove his impunity. That act unmasked him. He let the words sink, eyes closed now, as if the matter were already settled. The four sat in tense silence, glancing at one another, unsure who had just been condemned. Wolfe opened his eyes, their amber gleam fixed on Alton once more. Mr. Alton, he said, voice calm, when you left my office last time you betrayed yourself. You knew of the Baylis Hotel, though I had not mentioned it. You overplayed. The cipher is yours. Alton's composure cracked, his lips parted, then snapped shut. Sweat beaded his forehead. Fenn turned on him with a curse. Clara gasped. Paul let out a strangled whimper. Alton rose halfway from his chair, then froze under Wolfe's gaze. You, Wolfe said, sought to frighten Caldwell into silence, to keep the fund's clients from exposure. But Caldwell resisted. You abducted him, concealed him at the Baylis, and devised your cipher to scatter blame. Then, in your hubris, you invaded my house. Fatal error. Alton's voice was hoarse. You can't prove, Archie, Wolfe cut in without looking at me. Call Mr. Panzer. Inform him to collect Caldwell from the Baylis before dawn. Then ring Inspector Kramer. Our guest here will require a car. The office erupted, Fenn roaring, Clara protesting, Paul trembling. Alton sagged back into his chair, the slick veneer stripped. Wolfe closed his eyes again, serene, as if the matter were already filed away with the orchids. For me, the evening had just begun. The brownstone was thick with tension, but Wolfe had moved his pawns into place, and the board was his. Tomorrow, justice, legal or otherwise, would be delivered. Tonight, the suspects had learned the same lesson I had the first day I worked for him. You can bluff Wolfe or bait him, but once he positions himself, you're already finished. If there's one thing you learn working for Wolfe, it's that the moment he declares a man guilty isn't the end. It's the overture. The real performance comes after, when he forces every piece onto the stage and makes them play in harmony until the truth stands alone, bare and undeniable. That night's gathering hadn't ended with Alton in handcuffs. It ended with Wolfe leaning back, eyes shut, leaving the room to stew in its own unease. It was my job to manage the fallout until morning. Saul turned up before dawn with Franklin Caldwell in tow. He was thinner than his photograph, pale, clothes wrinkled from confinement, but alive. Saul had found him in Baylis 217, bound but not gagged, guarded by nothing but a locked door and Alton's arrogance. The man had tried to rise when we brought him into the brownstone, but Fritz insisted he sit and fed him broth as if he were one of Wolfe's orchids returning from drought. Caldwell's first words were less gratitude and more accusation. "I told you they'd come after me with numbers." Then he collapsed into sleep. By the time Kramer arrived at 9, Wolfe was prepared. He had positioned himself behind his desk like a judge on the bench, the cipher sheets arrayed before him. Eulton, red-eyed and cornered, sat where I put him, flanked by 2 of Kramer's men. Clara Henshaw, Fenn, and Paul Nesbitt had also been corralled back into the office, none of them pleased, but all of them unwilling to risk absence. Caldwell himself, restored enough to stand, was settled in a chair near the bookshelves, his wife beside him, her face tight with worry and relief. Kramer stomped in, taking in the scene with a scowl. "Well, Wolfe, this better not be another of your parlor plays. My men found Caldwell where Panzer said he'd be, all right, but I won't arrest you. You'd better deliver something that sticks." Wolfe's eyes opened, slow and deliberate. "Inspector, you will sit. I will deliver not a parlor play, but a recital of facts. Mr. Caldwell has survived a scheme orchestrated by his partner, Gregory Alton. The cipher proves it, his disappearance confirms it, and Alton's own tongue betrayed him." Alton barked, "Lies! This is entrapment!" "You can't silence," Wolfe snapped, the single word weighted enough to still him. "You lacked subtlety, Alton. Caldwell resisted your demands to shutter his private fund. You feared exposure not for him, but for yourself. Those clients who entrusted him with their clandestine investments would not forgive the firm if word spread. You needed him silenced, but you lacked the courage for blood, so you resorted to symbols, numbers, to intimidate, to scatter blame. But your cipher was crude. I solved it within hours. It pointed not to Caldwell's ruin, but to yours." Fenn leaned forward, growling. "So what you're saying, Alton played us all? Send us those numbers to make us think we were in it?" "Precisely," Wolfe said. "He invoked your names, Fenn, Henshaw, Nesbitt, as camouflage. He intended the police, should they intrude, to find a circle of enemies too broad to unravel. But then he grew arrogant. He trespassed here, into my house, twice. The first time to confirm whether the cipher had unsettled me. The second to assert his impunity. In both cases he exposed himself. He spoke of Caldwell as slower, a phrase Caldwell himself had once uttered to his wife, a private phrase. Only one who had heard him directly could echo it. Clara Henshaw's hand flew to her pearls. "So all the time while I thought Franklin ruined me, this was Alton's work. He wanted me implicated." "You ruined yourself," Wolfe said without sympathy. "But Alton sought to weaponize your bitterness. And Nesbitt's resentment, and Fenn's bluster. It was convenient to him that each of you hated Caldwell. You provided excellent cover." Nesbitt broke then, trembling, blurting, "I knew it! I knew they'd hang me out. I heard Alton boasting that he'd frame me if things went wrong. I swear I never touched Franklin." Alton's composure cracked. He lurched forward, voice harsh. "You pathetic little man! You'd have been nothing without Caldwell's introductions and nothing without me. I kept this firm from collapsing while he played games with illegal funds. If anyone deserves censure, it's him." Caldwell stirred then, rising to his feet. His voice was hoarse but steady. "You betrayed me, Gregory. I built that fund to protect clients from exposure. You saw only a threat to your reputation, so you locked me away and left me to rot." Wolfe cut through the rising clamour with a single phrase. "Enough. Inspector, you have your culprit." Kramer glared at Alton, then at Wolfe. "You're telling me this whole mess boils down to vanity and greed, not espionage, not some Wall Street cabal, just one partner afraid of being outshone?" "Fear," Wolfe said, "is the most consistent motive in human affairs. Fear of exposure, fear of humiliation." Alton feared both. And in his fear he fashioned a cipher he thought clever enough to deceive. But fear is transparent. It leaks through every gesture. Kramer jerked his chin at his men. "Take him!" The officers hauled Alton to his feet. He struggled, shouting of injustice, of Caldwell's complicity, but his words fell flat. The others sat stunned, each nursing their own blend of anger and relief. Caldwell sank back into his chair, his wife's hand gripping him tightly. As the office cleared, Kramer lingered. "Wolfe, you've given me motive and a confession in all but name, but I still don't like being used as your broom." "Then sweep less often," Wolfe replied without opening his eyes. "I will not apologize for preferring intellect to bludgeon." Kramer swore under his breath and left. The door shut, and the brownstone returned to silence, broken only by the faint rattle of Caldwell's breathing. I looked at Wolfe. "So that's it? Case closed. Partner arrested. Caldwell saved. No more numbers to untangle." "Pfui," Wolfe muttered. "The numbers were never the point. They were theatres. What mattered was the psychology." Alton believed himself untouchable. He was mistaken. Caldwell rose shakily and bowed slightly toward Wolfe. "I owe you more than I can say." "You owe me my fee," Wolfe said. "Archie will prepare the invoice. I desire no gratitude." That stung Caldwell's wife, but she bit back any retort, steering her husband out gently. When the door closed behind them, the brownstone was quiet again. Fritz reappeared with a tray for dinner, and Wolfe reached for his beer as though nothing had transpired. He took a sip, sighed, and finally spoke. "Archie, mankind has an incurable vice. It dresses greed in the garments of necessity, and fear in the mask of prudence. Numbers, ciphers, codes, they are only the costumes. The folly underneath remains the same." I leaned back, shaking my head. "Sure, but if they're all so predictable, why do we keep getting dragged into their messes?" Wolfe's eyes closed, the faintest smirk tugging at his mouth. "Because, Archie, predictability is inexhaustible, and fools are never in short supply." That was his benediction. The case of the cipher from Wall Street was over, the brownstone restored to its uneasy peace. Outside, the city rattled on with its usual noise, numbers flickering across tickers, fortunes rising and falling. But inside, dinner was served, Wolfe was satisfied, and my notebook was closed. For now. The day after Alton was hauled off, the brownstone breathed as though it had survived an illness. The air was heavy with the smell of Fritz's coffee cake, which Wolfe consumed with more relish than usual, and the orchids upstairs had never looked so smug. To an outsider, it might have seemed life had returned to its usual rhythms, but I knew better. Wolfe's silence wasn't digestion, it was reflection, which for him was a more dangerous state. Reflection meant the matter wasn't finished, not quite. I spent the morning fielding calls. Reporters, of course, eager to pry for details of Alton's arrest. Kramer, gruff and unwilling to give Wolfe credit, but unable to deny results, barked down the line that Alton was cracking faster than an egg under a hammer. He hadn't confessed in full, but the pieces were falling into place. Caldwell himself, still shaky, telephoned to express gratitude Wolfe didn't want. His wife called separately, her voice taut, asking whether her husband was truly safe. I told her Wolfe had said so, and for her, that seemed to suffice. By noon, Wolfe had pushed aside his books on orchids and turned his full weight toward the cipher sheets again. He no longer needed Alton to be as good as convicted, but Wolfe wasn't one to leave a tangle half unraveled. He summoned me with a flick of his fingers. "Archie," he said, "these numbers conceal a greater insult than Alton intended. Look here." He jabbed a sausage-like finger at one column. "Do you see the pattern?" I squinted. "I see digits. If there's a pattern, it's hiding like a mouse in a warehouse." He allowed himself a snort. "It is not a cipher of information alone, it is also a ledger." Alton's arrogance infected even his deceptive embedded account totals. Caldwell's AE fund, hidden, illicit, is exposed here in miniature. The clients will not thank him. That opened a new door, so Caldwell's still sitting on dynamite. "Precisely," Wolfe said. "And now that Alton has been unmasked, the clients may seek to distance themselves. Caldwell's survival does not end his peril." I didn't like the sound of that. "So we're not done babysitting? Foy, we are not wet nurses. Caldwell must secure his own affairs. We have fulfilled our obligation." That sounded final, but I knew Wolfe well enough to catch the undercurrent. He'd already drawn his conclusion. Caldwell's fund would collapse, his reputation wobble, and the man would limp through the rest of his career as damaged goods. That was the price of surviving. Wolfe wasn't sentimental enough to soften it. By late afternoon, Fritz announced dinner braised lamb with rosemary, peas in butter, and a custard tart, the kind of meal designed to restore Wolfe's balance. We ate in silence until I finally asked the question that had been needling me since Alton's outburst. "Why do you think he went so far, boss? He could have blackmailed Caldwell or cut him out quietly." "Why the theatrics?" Wolfe leaned back, sipped his beer, and closed his eyes. "Because men like Alton are vain. They mistake cunning for intellect, concealment for mastery. They cannot resist leaving a signature, however disguised. The cipher was his flourish, his boast that he could weave a web and remain unseen. But arrogance is a bright thread. I pulled, and the fabric unraveled. It was as close as he'd get to satisfaction. Still, he wasn't smiling. He never smiled after victory. For him, truth was nourishment, not amusement. The brownstone finally settled that night. The phone stopped ringing. Fritz retired to his kitchen kingdom. Wolfe sank into his chair with a book on 18th century French cookery. I was about to retreat to my room when the bell rang once more. It was Clara Henshaw. She stood on the stoop, shoulders squared, eyes sharper than when I'd last seen her. I considered telling her to come back in the morning, but her expression made me think better. I led her in. Wolfe looked up as she entered, lips tightening. "Madam?" I assumed we had concluded. She ignored the sting, sitting with controlled grace. "I came to say thank you. And to tell you something I should have told you before." I raised a brow, but Wolfe's hand kept me quiet. She drew a folded slip from her bag. "This. I found it in my bank box yesterday. I don't know how it got there. Numbers again, not like the others, but familiar." I took the slip. It was shorter, rougher. Wolfe examined it, nostrils flaring. "Alton," he said, attempted one last flourish. "This was meant for you, Mrs. Henshaw, to implicate you further, should suspicion drift his way. He planted it before his arrest. You are fortunate I now hold it." Her jaw tightened. "So I was nearly destroyed twice over, first by Caldwell's advice, then by Alton's malice. What does that make me, Mr. Wolfe? Victim? Fool? Neither," Wolfe said flatly. "It makes you human, which is worse." That silenced her. After a moment she stood. "Then I'll leave you to your orchids. Good night." She swept out, leaving the faint scent of perfume in her wake. I turned to Wolfe. That was harsh. "Truth often is," he said. And it was necessary. She must abandon illusions or she will ruin herself again. The house fell silent once more. Wolfe opened his book. The matter closed in his mind. For me, though, the image lingered. Clara's tight face, Caldwell's tremor, Alton's arrogance, undone. They were all numbers in a cipher. None of them understood until it was too late. I shut the office lights, leaving Wolfe in his chair, the glow of his lamp painting his bulk in gold. Outside, the city ticked on, the stock market humming with greed and fear, ciphers written and broken in endless repetition. Inside, the brownstone exhaled, whole again. Tomorrow would bring another knock, another plea, another tangle of human folly. But tonight, at least, dinner was done, the case resolved, and Wolfe had the last word. "Archie," he murmured, eyes on his page, "remember this. A cipher is nothing but numbers until a mind assigns meaning. Men, too, are ciphers, and most meanings are pitifully small." I didn't argue, I just noted it down because Wolfe's observations are the closest thing to scripture in this line of work. And with that, the house returned to its sanctity, sealed once more until the next disruption came to test it.